All right, open up your Bibles to 2 Corinthians 4 today as we continue our series in 2 Corinthians. And I want to start by talking a little bit more about St. Patrick. If you guys don't know the story, I'm delighted to get to share it with you. St. Patrick was a Roman, grew up in Britain, which was kind of the end of the Roman world in the 5th century. He grew up in a Christian family. His dad was deacon, but his faith wasn't especially important to him. Until when he was 16 years old, he was kidnapped by Irish slave traders and sold off into slavery in Ireland. You have to understand, at that time, no one had bothered to conquer Ireland, or if you're Irish, no one had been able to conquer Ireland. And therefore, no one had brought the gospel to Ireland. He was not part of the Roman Empire. And yet, in those 6 years that Patrick spent in slavery in Ireland, his faith in Christ blossomed. He was had a very lonely stage of life. He was a shepherd during that time, and yet that was the time that he devoted to prayer and to growing in his faith. After 6 years of slavery, Patrick escaped and managed to get back home to Britain. And yet, that's not where the story ends, because what happened next was really remarkable. Patrick went back to Ireland, this time voluntarily as the first missionary. Maybe you've heard the anecdote that Patrick drove all the snakes out of Ireland. It's a sort of a theologically numb way of understanding what's a really beautiful metaphor, right? Patrick drove the snake, right? How the devil's depicted as a snake, out of Ireland, right? He brought people to Christ for the first time. Now, normally St. Patrick's Day is celebrated here in the United States as a cultural holiday, often in ways that I'm not super enthusiastic about as a Christian, right? But I like to bring it up because I want us to consider Patrick's life. And this year, I especially want you to consider the good that God brings out of terrible circumstances. You know, when you think about this story, you can think about what would it have been like to consider the trauma that Patrick went through in those 6 years? To be kidnapped, enslaved, separated from your family, no doubt mistreated, probably beaten as a result, and to have to go through that, and yet none of it ends up being wasted. That's what we're going to talk about today. What does the Bible say about how our suffering points us to Christ? How did Paul understand his suffering, and where can we find meaning in our suffering today as Christians? We're going to talk about this little short passage that Patty read for us a moment ago in 2 Corinthians 4. And in these 3 verses, we're going to see 3 comparisons. In each case, Paul's going to challenge us. Where is your focus? Where is your attention? Where are you sort of devoting your gaze? Is it on the suffering that we experience in this life, or is it on what's to come? And in each of these 3 couplets, I hope you will consider the suffering that is present in your life and what you're doing with it. So it begins in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16, so we do not lose heart. You might recall a couple weeks ago, at the start of chapter 4, he used that same phrase, we do not lose heart. And we gave a whole sermon a couple weeks ago on what it means to lose heart and ways to avoid losing heart or burning out or getting discouraged in our ministry. Paul comes back to that phrase here again. He says, so we do not lose heart. So I titled the sermon, Don't Lose Heart, Part 2. And he's going to this kind of tips us off to some of the things today that have the potential to cause us to lose heart, specifically about how we understand our suffering. And the first one's here in verse 16 where he says, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. What is the wasting away of your outer self? Remember the problem Paul's been addressing throughout 2 Corinthians? We've talked about it a few times. How could God be with someone who's in such bad shape? He's been imprisoned, he's been beaten, he's been stoned. And you wonder, you get a little creative here in your mind, like, did Paul walk with a limp as a result of that? Did he have a swollen eye? He's probably missing teeth at this point after being stoned. He probably looked like a wreck. And Paul says, yes, my outer self is wasting away, but that is not all of me. Now, we'll experience Paul's words here probably at different ways in different stages of our life, in different circumstances of our life. But it's worth all of us reflecting on the reality that our bodies are wasting away too. For some of us, we hear that from the place of vanity. We hear that from the lens of the wrinkles that are around our eyes or the gray hair that is coming into our beard. That's mostly for me, but maybe for you too. And we say, I don't like that my body's getting older. I don't like that I can't do the things I used to do. I don't like that I can't exercise the way that I used to. In fact, I know I'm not alone in this because the plastic surgery business in the United States is a $20 billion a year business. I know that we share this, right? We share this kicking against the goads of our bodies wasting away. And we don't want it to be that way. So some of us cover our faces with makeup, or we dye our hair, or we get injections and we say, look, I'm not wasting away anymore. And yet we know that's not true. Every time we see hair going down the shower drain, every time we feel something hurt that we didn't even know existed before, we know that our body is wasting away. Now, when it's just vanity and jokes, it's actually easier to bear. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's also our capacity. Right? We can't do things we used to do. And I don't just mean like fun things like skiing, but things like driving. And we lose capacity. I mean, we lose the ability to carry out daily tasks or maybe live independently. And we say, I don't like this. I don't want to waste away. And for all of us, at any point, especially towards the end of our life, the wasting away becomes even more existential as we consider our impending death. We truly are, as Pastor Chris discussed last week, jars of clay, plain and brittle. Does this cause you to lose heart? I know it's not fun to talk about, but does it cause you to lose heart? Paul says it doesn't have to. For one, because it does narrate the reality of the world. And if we try to ignore the reality of the world, we're going to shipwreck a lot of our life. Because if we're under some mistaken assumption that our outer self shouldn't waste away, that our hair shouldn't fall out, that we shouldn't get wrinkles, that we should always be 21 in perpetuity, we're going to die 1,000 deaths in our life. Every time our back hurts, every time we find a new wrinkle, we're going to become angry about these things, as if they shouldn't happen, when of course they should. But more than that, Paul says, it's not just that the wasting away of our bodies describes reality. He goes on in verse 16 to say, there is another future for you. He says, even as my outer self is wasting away, my inner self is being renewed day by day. This is so important. Right? Even while our outer selves are wasting away, our inner selves are being renewed day by day. It means that there is a you to you that will never waste away. There is an aspect of who you are that will last for eternity. We don't just mean, like sometimes we'll say, her body is slowing down, but her mind is still sharp. No, it's more than that. Right? It's that there is a part of you, what Christians sometimes call the soul or the spirit, that will last for eternity. Yes, there's the resurrection of the body. That's really important. Yes, there's the new heavens and the new earth. That's really important. But in this passage, Paul's emphasis is on the idea that there is an aspect of who you are, as he says in Philippians 1, even when you are absent from your body, is present with the Lord. This is the you that endures, that lasts forever. And not only that it lasts, but it's renewed daily, Paul says in this passage. We experience every day the wasting away of our bodies. Every day there are reminders that we're not as young or as strong or as beautiful as we once were, or at least remember ourselves as having been. But in addition to those daily deaths, we also experience the daily renewal of the Holy Spirit, that he is with us and renewing our inner self day by day, and we look forward to the day that he will renew us completely. Whether that's when Jesus comes again or when our body dies, there will be some day that we are completely made whole and new with God forever. So we don't lose heart when our body wastes away. We can be frustrated by it. We can laugh about it. We can mourn over it at times, but we don't lose heart because it is not all of who you are or I am. You are not defined by your physical body alone. And this is a great reason for hope and celebration. Because no matter how beautiful you are, or how strong you are, or how much Botox you've had, your body and my body is wasting away. But we don't lose heart, because our inner self is being renewed day by day. So the second reason he says not to lose heart is that the suffering we experience in this life has a purpose for us. This is what he says in verse 17. He says, this light and momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Why does Paul describe his afflictions as light and momentary? Now, if this is your first week here in 2 Corinthians, you might say, oh, he must have had a really nice life that his problems are only light and momentary. I've got real problems. You do have real problems. And I don't want to make light of anyone's suffering. But I do just want to help you understand what Paul went through as he relays it in 2 Corinthians. Just in this book, he talks about losing his vocation and his reputation. He talks about being slandered by people who love him. He talks about being beaten and stoned for the gospel. He talks about how often in his life he's experienced a lack of sufficient food, clothing, or shelter. He talks about being shipwrecked 3 times, being imprisoned for the faith, and on top of all of that, carrying the daily anxiety and weight of the fledgling Christian faith. I know that many of you have gone through tremendous suffering, and I don't want to make light of any of that. But I think it's fair to say that Paul went through more physical suffering than any of us. He went through more suffering for the gospel than any of us. And he has earned the right to say, probably what I couldn't say in my own lived experience, he has earned the right to say that this is light and momentary compared to the weight of glory that we are expecting. That is worth reflecting on and thinking about. You know, because this question of comparison is at the heart of what he's describing. He's not saying suffering, it doesn't matter. That's not what Paul's saying. He's saying in comparison, it is light and momentary. A few years ago, our church had a worship pastor named Justin Fox, who we love. And Justin was sent out by our church to plant a new church, which is an important and difficult task, in his hometown of Arcata, California, up in Humboldt County near the Oregon border. And as Justin was preparing to do this, I was at a denominational meeting back in Ohio, and some Midwestern guys asked me, oh, Arcata, is that close to you guys in Seal Beach? That is the right response, right? Arcata is 650 miles away from us. In East Coast, in East Coast terms, that's like 12 states away or whatever. But it's all a matter of perspective. Because from his Ohio perspective, I don't know, it seems pretty close. You guys are both in California. And I wanted to say, well, it's only 2% of the distance around the world, so I guess in that sense it's close. Compared to the 290,000 miles it takes to get to the moon, I guess it's close, but it doesn't feel very close. Right? Well, what's my point? Right? In comparison, Paul's tremendous suffering was light and momentary compared to the weight of glory beyond all comparison. Paul makes a similar point in Romans 8:18 when he says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. In comparison with what we have to look forward to, our sufferings are light and momentary. Now that's an important truth in and of itself, but in 2 Corinthians, Paul makes an even more audacious claim. He doesn't just say they're not worth comparing, but that the sufferings themselves prepare us for a weight of glory. Do you see that in verse 17? That God, in some miraculous and mysterious way, uses our sufferings to prepare us for the weight of glory that we'll carry. This phrase, weight of glory, it's the only time it's used in the Bible as a phrase, and some of you might be familiar with a C.S. Lewis essay by that title, The Weight of Glory. The weight of glory itself as a phrase it's a tautology, meaning the one word is the same as the other one in the same terms. So glory, the Hebrew word for glory, refers to weightiness or heaviness. So Paul's doing a play on words here where he says the weight of weightiness, right? The weight of glory. All right, and that fire engine, I totally lost what I was talking about. The weight of weightiness. All right. And he says that this weight of glory is what God uses our suffering to prepare us for. Well, that's a big claim. And I don't want to speak out of my lived experience and say, well, out of my suffering, I can see the good that's come out of it, because your story is different than mine. And many of us, in a lot of our sufferings, never see this side of heaven, what good God brings out of it. But I think it's worth coming back to Patrick, our boy Patrick here, and thinking about how God used his suffering to prepare him for the ministry he gave him. Think about Patrick's suffering. This is sacred ground stuff, right? I don't want to haphazardly talk about it, because I know your suffering is really painful to think about and reflect on. But it also is worth reflecting and thinking on. So let's think about Patrick here for a second. Maybe you've heard the phrase, I didn't know God was all I needed until God was all I had. That was certainly true in Patrick's life. And suffering has this way of provoking in us a reliance on God like nothing else. Suffering also had a way in Patrick's life of loosening his grip on things that were wasting away. Do you think, honestly, Patrick ever would have gone to be a missionary in Ireland if he hadn't been sent there as a slave for 6 years? I don't think so. I think suffering has a way of loosening our grips on the things of this world. Suffering also has a way of producing virtue in us. Patrick's faith wasn't important to him until he went through suffering. And as Romans 5 says, that suffering produced in Patrick endurance and character and hope, and it can do the same thing in your life as well. And, for Patrick, suffering also gave him empathy. He gave him empathy for the Irish who hadn't heard the gospel. And your suffering has a way of producing in you empathy for others as well. So we don't lose heart when we go through suffering, because we trust that God truly can use it for his glory and for our good, and he used it to prepare us for the weight of glory in front of us. Now, Paul will use a similar phrase in verse 18 when he describes this weight of glory. He'll say that it is unseen things that are eternal, and that God is using our suffering to prepare us for things that we cannot yet see. Look at verse 18 with me. As we look not to the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Paul tells us that we need to be reminded of the fleeting nature of everything that we see. This is one of those things that when we start thinking about can apply to all aspects of our life, that everything that we see is fleeting, that it's transient, that it is here today, gone tomorrow. That includes our bodies, of course, but it also includes the things that we give our attention to, the things that matter so much to us on a day-to-day basis. We need to be reminded that they're fleeting, they were transient, they will be gone before we know it. Even things that seem like they're going to stand the test of time, you know that expression? We know that kingdoms rise, as Scripture says, and kingdoms fall. That things that seem like they'll last forever are gone before we know it. And Paul says when we look at those things, when we gaze on them, when we give our attention to them, we need to be reminded that they'll be gone before we expect. Now, there's an interesting play on words that Paul does here, he says. There's an interesting play on words Paul does in verse 18. He says, we look not to the things that are seen. Now think about that for a minute with me. We don't look at things that we see. That doesn't make any sense. We don't look at things that we see. Those are the only things we can look at, are things we can see. Now, when you think about that, it's worth sort of reflecting on, is there more to what Paul's saying than meets the eye? Oh, there's a bad pun. The NIV says we fix our eyes. The CSB says we focus. The Greek participle behind this has the idea of where do you gaze? Where do you give your attention to? What do you pay special attention to in your life? Where are you focusing your attention? An illustration to describe this: what do you gaze at when you're driving? What do you give your attention to? What do you focus at? Obviously, I hope it's not your phone. I hope it's not the radio. I hope it's not your lunch or your makeup or whatever. But I hope it is where you are going, right? I hope your focus and your gaze is out the front window. Now, you can glance at other things. You should glance at other things. Right? You should glance at the rearview mirror, side mirrors, your blind spots. You should give some glancing attention to those things in greater support and in greater purpose of where your gaze is set. I learned this the hard way when I was 15 years old. I was learning to drive in a relatively small town, and my dad said, before you get your driver's license, we need to take you on some real freeways in a big city. So we drove up to San Jose, the nearest large city by me, and drove on a four-lane, four lanes at a time freeway for the first time. And I did not do well. In fact, I was in the carpool lane going 65 miles an hour in a 65 zone because I knew I didn't want to speed. And people were flying by me on the right and not enthusiastic about my driving. And my dad said, you should probably either speed up or get over. And I said, no, I'm not falling for that one. I'm not going to speed up. I'm going to change lanes. Now, my gaze had been front and center, but I said, I got to check my blind spot. And so I did. And I was really concerned on blind spot because I'd never driven on a freeway with this many cars before. And I really wanted to make sure that I didn't hit anybody when I changed lanes. And then my dad said, look out. And I looked up to see the BART because I had weaved off of traffic and I was looking at a subway or whatever the BART is. And so I overcorrected in my Ford Aerostar minivan, which is not really, a luxury vehicle. Too far to the right, too far to the left, too far to the right. And then the minivan said, this is too much turning for me. And it J-turned across 4 lanes of traffic. And I can still, if I close my eyes, picture going backwards across the 85 freeway and seeing cars all coming at me. And by God's grace and their good driving, I didn't hit anybody. I just went backwards across 4 lanes of traffic and rear-ended the retaining wall on the other side of the freeway. CHP comes by and says, well, you didn't hit anybody else, and you didn't do any damage to the wall, so I don't actually have to write you a ticket, but maybe your dad should drive for a while. That is a good idea. So why do I share that story with you? Right? Here's the reason. Looking in my blind spot was worthy of a glance. It was good that I glanced at it. It just wasn't worthy of my gaze. Right? Looking at something briefly, it was good, but it wasn't worthy of my gaze. And when I gave it my whole gaze, I destroyed everything around me. I think this is what Paul's getting at with our lives. There are things that are worth glancing at in our lives. Our careers, our physical health, our politics around us, all kinds of things, right? They're worthy of our glance, but they're not worthy of our gaze. They're not worthy of our worship. They're not worthy of giving our whole lives to. When we do that, we turn our lives upside down. When we gaze at things that are seen rather than unseen, things that are transient rather than things that are eternal, we end up crashing our lives because we try to make them into ultimate things that they were never made to carry the weight of. Instead, Paul says, we gaze at, we give special attention to, we devote ourselves to things that are unseen. What are these unseen things? Well, if you go down one verse, the very first verse of chapter 5, we'll talk more about this next week, he talks about how we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. When we set our gaze not on the sufferings we experience now, but on the reward in front of us for eternity with God, it puts all aspects of our life in their proper and right order. When we consider our future in heaven, it makes the transient quality of this world around us obvious. Now, I know a lot of people object to this, right? There have been people in the last number of centuries who have said, you guys focus so much on heaven as Christians that you miss out on the problems of this world. That was one of Marx's core objections to Christianity, why he called religion the opiate of the masses. He said, you're distracting from the real problems of this world. And I would say in response, oh, no. Having a firm hope in heaven actually gives us grounds for dealing with the problems of this world. It helps us to be people like Patrick who say, I can give up my life here on earth and endure suffering because this is not all there is. It actually empowers me to be able to take on the problems of this life, especially the spiritual problems of this life. Enables us to be people like John Perkins, who died this week, one of my heroes. If you've never heard of John Perkins before, I would encourage you to Google him when you get home. There's a great eulogy on the Gospel Coalition site. But John Perkins grew up in the Jim Crow South in Mississippi. His brother was murdered by a corrupt and racist marshal in their town. And Perkins, during some of the civil rights movement, was beaten mercilessly. And by all by all sort of normal measures, Perkins should have ended up a very angry and bitter man, but he ended up being a leader of the racial reconciliation movement within Christianity in the last 100 years. And Perkins, in his last book that he wrote, just got published last year, titled Count It All Joy. It was his reflections on suffering. And in Perkins' own words, as he thought back on the suffering he experienced and the suffering he saw around him among his peers, he said the reason that he was able to endure that was his hope of heaven and his hope of being with God forever. So, what about you? What about me? Do you focus more on your outer self that is wasting away, or your inner self that's being renewed day by day? What about the second part? Does affliction feel like the heaviest thing in the world to you because you have nothing to compare it to? Or does the reality of heaven make it light and momentary? And are you more focused to your gaze on the things that you can see, the things you can grab, the things you can hold on to now, or the hope that we have of being with Christ forever? Let's close our time in prayer. God, I pray for my friends who are here for whom this is a difficult message because, like Paul, they endure a lot of suffering. Maybe they're even in physical pain right now. And it is hard for them to have that be anything but where they've put all their attention. God, I pray that the reality of what you have done for us on the cross would give in them a reason to trust that their suffering is not meaningless. God, I pray for my friends who are here for whom the things of this world are so attractive and so compelling and where they fit their gaze because it has given them so much positive reinforcement in a lot of ways. God, I pray that like Patrick, you would do a mighty work to evoke in us a gaze on things that are unseen. In Christ's name we pray.